With that, we will go ahead and get started. I see there's about 40 folks in climbing on the call, so thank you for joining. Thank you for attending this session titled Effective Cross-Sector Collaboration on Economic Reopening. My name is Annalisa Siregar-Wurm. I'm the Director of Education and Workforce Development with the Inland Empire Economic Partnership. We're glad you're here. This session is designed for us to inform one another on the efforts happening throughout the state, to share best practices with regional networks and partners. This breakout session on cross-sector collaboration has been designed to be as interactive with all of you as possible. We will be doing that by utilizing the chat box on Zoom, which is going to be at your lower center of your screen. Feel free to use that. Susan has graciously offered to field questions, and we will be doing that throughout the time together. Our format for the session will include 4 brief presentation groupings. After each grouping, we will have time for 1 to 2 questions from the chat. Again, please utilize that chat box on Zoom with your questions. We will field those, and then after our final presentation from Aneesh from the Governor's Office, we will begin a time of general question and answer time. With that, I'd like to just mention a few housekeeping items. For those who know and who are able to, if you're not speaking, please mute yourselves and turn off your camera so we can highlight our presenters. And with that, we can go ahead and get started. I'd like to extend a warm welcome and thank all of our presenters on the call today. Peter Villegas, Vice President and Head of Latin Affairs with Coca-Cola. Paul Granillo, President and CEO of the Inland Empire Economic Partnership. Gregg with the Redwood Coast COVID-19 Economic Recovery Committee. Leila Roberts, also of the Redwood Coast COVID-19 Economic Recovery Committee. Mark Baza, the Executive Director of the Imperial County Transportation Commission. Rebecca Terrazas-Baxter, Intergovernmental Relations Director for the County of Imperial. And Aneesh Raman with the State Economic Recovery Task Force. So with that, I invite our first guest, Mr. Peter Villegas of the Coca-Cola Company, to give some opening remarks and global insight from a worldwide company. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, everybody. I'm glad to be here. Happy to participate. For us at Coca-Cola, who is worldwide, we've learned a lot from other countries, Thailand, Italy, and others that have been affected a little bit before. The U.S. was hit with COVID, and we've tried to apply the best practices and the learnings into our operations here in the U.S., and then work with others in other industries and other regions with ideas on what has helped us. Here in the U.S., consumer spending is up in May versus April, and people are starting to get out to restaurants, although there's a strong feeling that they prefer in dining or ordering in. I think just to get to the point in what we've been seeing in recent days is in the other countries, they've been pretty disciplined in following the regulations set by the government to sort of prevent an uptick in COVID in the second phase. And unfortunately here in the US, and in California, Florida, and other key markets, that hasn't been the case. We haven't seen the discipline from the US as we've seen in other countries. In the other countries where they have complied with the regulations, with the rules set forth by their countries or their states, they've done well in reopening slowly. Businesses are starting to come back, although more online compared to people still hesitant to get out. And we've been sharing some of this with some of the markets across the country, including here in the Inland Empire with the IEEP. And so 1/3 of the new online shoppers are baby boomers. What we found both in the other countries and here is that this generation is also likely to have resumed social activities over the last 2 weeks relative to the other generations. The younger generation is obviously very active, very social. And for us, as we've learned in the other countries, if the populations would comply and be more disciplined in following the rules and the restrictions set forth by the respective governments who are going on data, who are going off science, I think we'd have a better opportunity to reopen. And so those are some of the things that we've learned across the country that we hope to apply here in California.
Thank you, Peter, for that interesting global insight. I'd like to welcome up Paul Granillo, who's also a 2018 Regional Steward Leader honoree, to be the first to speak on our local efforts. Paul?
Insight. Those of you who might not know, Peter is also the chairman of the board of the Inland Empire Economic Partnership. And we've been grateful to have him.
Hi, Paul. Can you turn off your video? That might help with the audio. Paul, can you hear me? If so, can you turn off your video, and that might help with the audio.
The perspective that the partnership, a region of 4.6 million people, 11% of Californians. And so my presentation today reflects that type of thinking when it comes to recovery. We're looking at the economics, we're looking at equity. We want to come out of this stronger. Historically, the Inland Empire has lagged in economic downturns, and our goal is really not to have that happen again. And again, to come out of this in a stronger, more equitable way. The Inland Empire has the 5th largest Latino population in the United States. We're about 52% Latino, 8% African American, so it's very heavily a minority region and a very large one. We stood up again early in April, the Inland Empire Business and Employment Recovery Fund and Task Force. And so I'm going to go to the slides now. Annalisa. So just to give you a snapshot really quickly, this is unemployment. And you can see on last Friday, the unemployment figures came out. The US at 13.3, California at 16.3, the Inland Empire at 14.9, and Los Angeles County at 20.9. So very serious numbers not seen before in most of our lifetime. This is a sectoral picture, so it kind of paints a picture of the Inland Empire. The peach is where employment was in April. You can see that in the Inland Empire, logistics is the #1 industry. And because the Inland Empire is very much a supply chain hub on the West Coast, currently we are holding up the economy of California and the West Coast with the services that we're able to provide through fulfillment and delivery. And so you have to imagine what the last 3 months would have been like if we didn't have the opportunity to get so many of our food supplies and just other goods delivered. And that's going to be a game changer for us in the future. Next slide, please. And we can go to the next slide. So what did we do? Go back one, please. So what did we do? We set up three teams in our economic recovery task force: a research team, economic recovery team, and a workforce recovery team. And those three teams and their chairs are working together to help us understand how we best can come out of the economic downturn. Next slide, please.
Hi, Paul. I think your connection.
The first team is made up of both Chancellor Wilcox and President Morales are going to work to bring other academics and researchers into the mix. So two goals here in research. One is to make sure that we are giving our policymakers all of the up-to-date information and data that they have to inform their policy decisions. And two, to make sure that we are representing our region when it comes to issues of resources. The next slide, please. So the next team is our economic recovery team. And here we're bringing together our business leaders in the region together with our the two counties, Riverside and San Bernardino. And so Peter, who presented, chair of IEP and vice president of Latin Affairs for Coca-Cola, together with Al Arguello, who's the market president for B of A, together with supervisors Janice Rutherford of San Bernardino County and Karen Spiegel of Riverside County. For us, it's really key to have the counties working together through the recovery. While we are 4.6 million people, we are very much tied together as a metropolitan statistical area. And so we want to make sure that we're focused on understanding where each sector is and what we need to do to help it recover faster. Slide, please. So the nature of this work, a subcommittee focused in on. We've been listening, and it's very important, I think, to listen.
Paul, have we lost you? Hi, Paul. Can you hear us now?
So very key to listen to. Where did I drop?
You were talking about the groups, but I think it'll help if you turn off your video.
Going to turn off my video. All right. So the subcommittees, municipal government, small business, and you can see the rest. Right now, we know that small business, the restaurants, mom and pops, that they're hurting. The next sector that we see a major downturn in and job loss is in municipal government. And so just key to listen to all of the different pieces of the economic puzzle and to have leaders that are steward leaders, care about the region and want to participate in this work. Next slide, please. And so the last committee is one focused on workforce. And here again, because we have the two counties, we're bringing leadership from the two county workforce investment boards together with our Inland Empire Desert Regional Consortium of the community colleges. There are 12 community colleges in Riverside and San Bernardino. And together with Dr. Carlos Ayala, who heads our educational collaborative, which is really doing great work in in the Inland Empire. So we've really got to look at our displaced workers, the conversation that has to occur between the employers and what their needs are currently is key to informing the workforce investment boards, the community colleges, and then we need to look at special populations, right? So the class of 2020 graduating from college into the worst job market, what can we do for them? Displaced workers that may not have an opportunity to go back to their job, what new opportunities are available? And again, our three teams are working closely to come up with prioritized needs by sector, and then a short, midterm, long-term strategic plan on how we the downturn and into recovery. Okay. All right, Annalisa, I think that's it.
Great, thank you, Paul, and thank you to Peter. Susan, I'll turn to you. I think we have time for perhaps one question if folks have one for Peter or Paul.
Sean Takita had a question, Paul, asking why the info sector dropped. I wondered if you had any background on that. It was surprising to Sean.
Why the what? I missed the question, Susan.
The information sector dropped in your slides.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, we're not sure. We're still looking into that one because you would have thought that it would have doubled or tripled. But the economists are looking at that one, and I will make sure that we get back to you with whatever they come up with.
Wonderful.
And then there's just also one comment, class of 2020 is having a very difficult time right now looking for opportunities. So thank you for bringing that up.
Can I just add one more thing as we close? For us, we participated in a survey of Fortune 500 CEOs, and the majority of them expect that it'll take at least 2022 for a full economic activity. And these are CEOs that have responsibilities for worldwide. It's not specific to the U.S., but 2022 is the latest on Fortune 500 CEOs. So just wanted to add that as well.
Wonderful, thank you, Peter. I'd now like to welcome Gregg Foster and Leila Roberts from the Redwood Coast to give their remarks.
All right, we're on. Well, hello from Ferndale, California. We're at the balmy 62 degrees this morning on the coast, or this afternoon on the coast. So we're going to talk a little bit about something we did in the local region, and it's kind of expanded into in something bigger. And are the slides up? I'm not able to see on my phone.
Yep, they're up, Greg. Go ahead.
Great. Okay, so I assume we're on slide 1. Yeah, there we go. I see it. So if we can go to the next slide, so it's interesting. We basically have in Humboldt County and throughout the region, but particularly in Humboldt County, very strong regional working relationships that are historical. So we're used to talking and working with each other anyway. Many of us are co-located. We share facilities. For example, my organization, Redwood Region Economic Development, shares an office building with the Film Commission, the Small Business Development Center, and Leila's shop, and the County of Humboldt Economic Development and the Workforce Development Board. So we're all together anyway. And so we didn't have to necessarily build a completely new set of relationships, although it's expanded. But we knew we faced a bunch of challenges, and that's, as this issue started moving forward, the COVID issue, we started seeing as lenders, and I'm sure Leila saw this as a Small Business Development Center, immediate employer needs. And this is even pre-shutdown, because we've seen data that the sales in revenue has been dropping even prior to the shutdown pretty significantly for some of the employees. And so we needed a way to be able to just respond quickly. And we needed to do that while we were getting prepared to all basically scatter. We closed our offices to the public, and then we ended up doing the shelter in place. So my staff and Leila's staff all ended up working from home, yet we had unprecedented growth in employer needs. So, so we had to figure out a way to restructure our communications and provide good, consistent information to folks. And we had to do that while almost hourly, if not daily, changes in guidance from the SBA and other federal and state aid entities on what programs were available and what they could be doing as you know, pre-CARES Act and post-CARES Act. There was just a lot of uncertainty about the rules, what was going to be offered and whatever. And we were in the middle between those folks who needed help and those folks who were providing help in many ways. And we also had to make decisions quickly. And, you know, those of us, we're used to more deliberative processes, I think, in our field, where, you know, we gather data, we look at strategies, we begin to implement. There's usually lots of sticky dots involved. And we just didn't have time for that. We had to make decisions hourly, if not daily. And so that was one of the other challenges. And then we had to have, because everybody was talking about it, we had to make sure that all these various entities were providing a consistent message on what's available and what we could offer and what's happening. And so we spent a lot of time using these calls that we'll describe in a little bit, just to educate ourselves. And we really relied heavily upon Leila and her shop because they have the direct contact with the SBA, and that was going to be the major types of employer-related program help that we'd be seeing. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Leila, and she'll do the next slide.
Thank you, Gregg. So you'll see all this laid out, and you can return to it, and you're welcome to ask us questions. But I would like you to envision for a moment with us what this felt like. So imagine a rural coastal community, people unable to be in direct contact with one another, but who had, you know, overlapped in many ways over the prior years. Friday, March 13th, Gregg and I find out that we're both planning to convene people to figure out what to do to help businesses respond to the pandemic. And from March 16th until this Monday, we've had about 45 meetings. And if you can imagine what it takes to free time from people from workforce development agencies, from the chambers, from banks and credit unions and other community lenders, universities and the community college, that demonstrates to me a pretty extraordinary level of commitment, but it also demonstrates that since we've still got 20 to 40 people on the calls every damn time we have them, it demonstrates that we are creating value for the participants. And here's how it looks. People were invited based on their pre-existing participation in something that we had called the Prosperity Network, which emerged from a many years ago county economic development strategy process. And then folks invited one another who hadn't yet heard about these meetings until we were essentially at a roughly 30 to 40 group size. And with every meeting, we ended up doing, of course, the typical information exchange. What is going on? What is the latest information coming from the SBA, coming from the state or the county regarding reopening plans, et cetera? But we also did a little bit of collective sense making. We would decide together whether we felt that a certain announcement coming from a major agency needed to be further vetted before it was communicated out to the business community for action. We would decide together, okay, well, this is what we're hearing from our small business clients, who certainly did not have time to be on these calls. And so we needed to make sure we were keeping an ear to the ground. And by we, I mean the chambers, the lenders, and the Small Business Development Center. And we would each take a piece of the work. So when a multimedia piece needed to be created, to communicate the potential benefits of the EDD's Workshare program. One of us asked for it, somebody else provided the content, and a third entity actually produced the video, and we got it out within 3 days. So there were immediate practical benefits to meeting so frequently. I will also add that the counties involved were meeting separately and were having trouble collecting, for example, the data that they needed for their economic injury surveys required as part of the Emergency Operations Centers networks across the state. So this group was pivotal in making sure that usable data was collected about the impact of the pandemic on our community. Another thing that I thought was frankly extraordinary was even as we were pushing out information about the iBank loan guarantees, about the SBA's economic injury disaster loan programs, we were putting on virtual rapid response layoff help events for multiple businesses, the Paycheck Protection Program. Quietly and intensively through this group, local jurisdictions and community lenders were forming local emergency response funds. So they were turning these around within 1 to 3 weeks, while many of our clients were waiting for many more weeks for other sources of emergency.
We made our first loan on March 24th.
Yeah, we went into shutdown on the 19th, and the first loan came out the 24th.
Yeah.
So what you're hearing, I think, is a pattern of an existing kind of community capital that we tapped and intensified, that we created immediate benefits for one another, and that those benefits, I mean, as far as I can tell, we're probably going to keep meeting for the next several months. And we anticipate that in our rural community, the recovery process is probably going to take at least another 18 to 24 months to fully play out, based on the lessons learned from the Great Recession. So more than happy to share the actual process for how this works, but I think I want to finish with a little description of how we grew ourselves from a county-based to a regional group. So I think next slide is good, and then we'll wrap up shortly for questions. So the Humboldt County Emergency Response Group had been meeting intensively for several weeks, but about a little more than a month ago, it became clear that there were certain points of leverage that were really only going to be tapped if we reached out to our neighboring counties. So we started informally getting together on Fridays as a Redwood Coast resilience group comprising Del Norte County and adjacent tribal lands, Humboldt County, Trinity, and Mendocino. And from those conversations, we identified certain priorities that fit our criteria. And these were timely, relevant to the pandemic, and something that we could directly influence. If it was something that was going to be happening at the state level, maybe we would want to advocate for a particular approach, but we really wanted to identify things that we could, as a group, move forward as a multi-county region. So I'm going to name these, and then I'll pop it back to you, Gregg, to offer some final thoughts and open for questions. But just consider these priorities emerged organically from this group, and I imagine they're not going to look surprising to anyone. Broadband ended up being number one. Everybody voted, and it was clear that both now and for the future, the work of Connie Stewart and her Center for California Center for Rural Policy to advance fast, affordable, accessible broadband infrastructure in our region had suddenly become dramatically more important, even more than it had been. A group immediately started convening across the workforce centers and the community college to work on workforce training, skill sets pertinent to virtual workforces, to dealing with the new retail scenes and scenarios, and more. Childcare, especially in our area, it is very difficult for workers who are trying to get back to work to find affordable, accessible childcare. It is very difficult for the childcare service providers to be able to operate safely and effectively and affordably. So we raised that up as our third priority. On down the list very quickly, a couple of obvious ones. We understand that it's entirely likely that the Costco in our county is going to be able to access PPE and safety and hygiene supplies, but the convenience store that provides the sole source of food and groceries for, let's say, a farther out part of our county or community may not be able to afford the bulk costs, and certainly won't be able to ensure a secure supply chain of PPE and safety and hygiene supplies to stay open. So we took that on as a project. We thought it would be interesting to collect information, not just about economic injury, but about needs, goals, pivoting, innovations across multiple counties. So there's a data collection group. And business debt assistance is on hold for now, but very soon we're going to start taking a very hard look at the potentially seriously damaging impact on our community of what happens in a few months when all of these federal and state loans come due, the repayments due, and our businesses may or may not be able to operate at full margins. What can we do to anticipate that and to prevent the devastation of our small business economies? Other priority areas: tourism, identifying topics that we felt were worth advocacy at the state level, regional grant seeking. Arts and culture is very important in our various counties. Worker safety, housing, film. You can see that we are sort of shifting as the needs of our communities shift. But the first 5 priorities I named are the ones we're concentrating on right now. So very quick overview, happy to answer questions about the when, who, and how. Gregg, final thoughts before we answer questions?
Well, the interesting thing about this is I think we've learned how to do some of what we're supposed to be doing every day even better than we've done. And our communications are sharper, our decision making is quicker. I think we're really hyper focused. I am, after being in this executive director's chair for 20 plus years now, increasingly impatient. And I'm finding that our discussions, people say, okay, let's do it. And we have a broad agreement and we move on something that's really quick. And that's because we have so much customer pressure to react. The other thing I think is great, and we have a standard agenda, which, as I initiate the call, I think, because I bought Zoom first. And the standard agenda is based really kind of on a model I heard. My wife actually lives in New York City and works for an airport, and they have an 8 a.m. check-in call every day. And anybody that knows anything about running an airport is that it's a disaster every day that they have to manage. And so it's a very standard with people, check-in questions. And so people know what to expect when they get there, and that they're very well trained, and it's been very efficient that way. And finally, it's been interesting. We started with a core group on this, but one of the things we said to people is there somebody else that should be participating? Go ahead and send them the link and have them invite. And so it grew quite a bit. And again, we have 25 to 35 people on the call, 3 times a week. Actually, Friday's a little bit bigger. That's about 40 to 45 because it's regional. So we're involving new people, and some are contributing, some are just listening and getting good information. And so it's been great because even though we're really working in suboptimal conditions here, we're all working from home, we're stressed out, we can't figure out what's going on. I think we've actually gotten better at talking to each other, even though we're not face to face, and really figuring out things. We're pleasantly free of sticky dots and notepads on the wall and lots of very detailed notes coming back later. It's just like, okay, let's do this and let's get it done. Now that doesn't work for everything, obviously, but primarily we are service providers on the ground, and so we didn't have time to design the perfect system. And we weren't given the time. I didn't have enough time to write a short story. you know, we had to push it, and it was great. It was great. And I would encourage, I mean, I'm hopeful that we will do these calls, probably less frequently, but do these calls even post-pandemic, where we just call in, check in, get some stuff done, and really be consistent and action focused on our core purpose, which is providing direct service to these businesses. So I think Leila put a link to our standard agenda there. Yeah, I'll ask, we can answer any questions now. It's kind of hard to describe, but if you ever want to listen in, just send us an email and we'll send you the Zoom link and you can listen in and how we do it.
Thank you, Gregg and Leila. I may take you up on that. That sounds like some good discussions, and I like that optimism about keeping that up post-pandemic. I think that's something that we can take with us moving forward. Susan, do we have maybe one question from the chat?
So we do have one, and Leila did provide the link, but Leila, maybe you want to speak to this just a little bit more. From Rebecca Christensen, how does your impressive Redwood Coast Resiliency Group document your journey?
I was smiling at that question because one of my roles in the past was as best practice, global best practice exchange leader for an international network of nonprofits. And I'm going to give you the answer that our peers used to often give. Document, we just did it. But
yeah, exactly.
The truth is, so first of all, we don't record and we don't take notes, but we do have a standard agenda, and we do have a shared Google Drive folder that is absolutely open to everyone who participates in these calls, and is hosted within the SBDC's account, but allows for collaboration that we don't have to control. So a lot of the documentation is actually happening in sub-working groups that document their own work and then bring it back to the larger group. But no notes, no recordings. I think this is the way we document it, by talking about it to others.
Yeah, I mean, documenting it wasn't really top of mind. It was like, holy crap, we've got to do something quick. Yeah, so, you know, there wasn't a lot of depth planning. There wasn't a lot of, you know, we got to practice a model or anything else. It's like, we got to get stuff done and we got to do it quick.
Wonderful. Thank you both, Leila and Gregg, for your insight.
I forgot to mention one other benefit, which was that I can attend all meetings now wearing flip-flops and shorts and a nice shirt.
Sign me up, Gregg. Sign me up. So our last pairing before we hear from Aneesh is going to be from our neighbors in Imperial County. I welcome Rebecca Terrazas-Baxter and Mark Baza. We welcome you to the mic.
Thank you, Annalisa. I'll begin. The Imperial County Transportation Commission serves as the regional transportation agency and council of governments for Imperial Valley. I want to highlight a few of our long-term goals that are also on the front end of our short-term recovery. And these are some core areas that we've highlighted in our comprehensive economic development strategy that will be shortly upgrading to focus on the short-term recovery efforts, of which Becky Terrazas-Baxter will talk a little bit about. Our core areas include binational trade with Mexico, broadband expansion, highway construction, sand dunes, tourism, agriculture, and all of the efforts of our small business development centers work to support our local businesses. On the binational trade side, you know, this is a big part of our freight and logistics efforts here in Imperial County, as well as benefit to the entire state and the U.S. as $16 billion annually cross through our land ports of entry here in Imperial with Mexico, and an estimated $1 billion in consumer retail expenditures that comes from Mexico annually. Not many people realize this, but just for Imperial and Mexicali, 50,000 people cross into Imperial County from Mexico. Now, this is certainly pre-COVID-19 numbers, and we'll be working towards improving that over time. But as many of you know, we have a the president has limited travel through our borders. But the trade is still flowing, but probably not as big as it has been in the past. For broadband expansion, our Imperial Valley Economic Development Corporation has been working over the last couple of years with public and private sector to assess the needs of our underserved communities, to identify opportunities to improve broadband capacity, and particularly in areas for educational purposes and access to financial institutions. So over this coming year, we expect to start working towards implementing some strategies to improve that broadband access in the valley. One of our areas that we think will help us sustain our economy is Imperial has been successful to have over $500 million of funding for highways that has created about 8,500 jobs that will continue through the year 2022. We have two areas of construction supplies. Imperial is home to one of the largest gypsum plants in the country, supplying more than half of the drywall in the United States. And Imperial County is also a large supplier of construction aggregate materials, including sand and gravel. For tourism, we're hoping that this helps us sustain as well, because it's tied to our sand dunes. There are thousands of off-road highway vehicle enthusiasts that support almost 5,000 direct jobs and an estimated $350 million in retail sales. And one of our staples of our economy has been agriculture, as we've had $2 billion annually in economic value. But COVID-19 has impacted those businesses as well as the farm workers. And lastly, I can't emphasize all the efforts of our Imperial Valley Small Business Center and all the work that they've been doing, especially since the pandemic, to providing loans and support to and investment opportunities for our local businesses, and no-cost one-on-one counseling and entrepreneurship training to help businesses have sustainable success. As I mentioned, we'll be working to highlight or work on some short-term recovery efforts on all of those areas. But now I'll turn it over to Becky Terrazas-Baxter from the County of Imperial. She will highlight how our county leadership has been working with our local business and chambers of commerce. Becky?
Great, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark, very much for that great overview of our region and also our economy and the dependence that we have on our tourism from not just our off-road enthusiasts, but also our temporary winter residents that we have that we call snowbirds. And also the spending capital that we're dependent on from our neighbors to the south in Mexico. Good afternoon, all. I want to thank California Forward for inviting me to speak today on behalf of the county, but also representing the public sector and local government on this panel. I mean, for Imperial County, cross-sector collaboration is playing and will continue to play a significant role in our economic recovery process. As you may have seen in national news over the past few weeks, Imperial County was hit hard by COVID-19, suffering some of the highest COVID-19 infection rates per capita of any California county. In addition to that, we have historically had the highest unemployment rates in California pre-COVID. Actually, in February, it was at about 17–18%, which sadly is actually something good for our county. Those are actually good numbers for us. Now in April and May, we were, as we're in the middle of this crisis, we're hovering at 28%. So therefore, I just want to kind of paint that picture for you. Our outlook post-COVID-19 is highly concerning to us, especially since we're one of only 4 counties in the state of California that is still stuck in stage 2A of the state's resilience roadmap. Consequently, that means that the majority of our businesses are still closed and they're desperately hurting. So we are highly concerned about the long-term economic impacts for the region. Luckily, though, one thing I want to talk about is we have a great group of agencies that have formed the Imperial Valley Business Recovery Task Force, and they formed that in late March. And what they do is they provide local businesses with information related to available resources or financial assistance. They also provide ideas on how to modify business operations in order to adjust to the new safety requirements and restrictions. They assist us and other agencies in relaying information and reinforcing our messaging between the Imperial County Public Health Department and local businesses. And they also serve as a voice for the business community when it comes to policy development and regulations as they're being developed, and that could impact businesses in the future. The task force is made up of our local chambers, our Small Business Development Center, our Farm Bureau, city representatives, the Imperial Valley Economic Development Corporation, and very similar situation to Redwood, where a lot of the different agencies kind of are co-located and so forth. It's the same with SBDC and IVEDC and the Broadband Coalition and a few others. And also, in part of that task force is our county's Workforce and Economic Development Department. So this cross-sector coordination is important because as representatives of the business community, they are able to tell us at the county what may or may not work when implemented prior to adoption. So in case changes are needed prior to so, we can do those policy changes to make sure that whatever policy or regulations we put in place based off of state guidance, it is more effective. Since its establishment, the County of Imperial CEO office, which is the office where I'm located, and the Public Health Department have been working closely with the task force to do many things. One is we have created a general worksite protection plan, which is now required for businesses who are permitted to reopen. That's easily accessible and also user-friendly. So their input was very valuable. We have created and assisted with the distribution of a standardized notification poster for businesses to post at their entrances that informs its customers of required social distancing measures and practices. We practice consistent messaging. We produce consistent messaging for people to practice good respiratory and other hygiene practices that can protect you and those around you, with the hope that it will help our COVID infection rates, thus allowing us to reopen our economy sooner. We have developed 2 small working groups with the task force and others, and one that is focused on collaborating to ensure businesses are prepared to reopen once we're able to move in this roadmap. And the other working group focuses on communication with the public to ensure consistency in messaging and that our messaging meets the needs of all of its residents. In addition to this constant coordination with the business community through the task force, in an effort to minimize some of the COVID-related impacts to local businesses, our Board of Supervisors, the Imperial County Board of Supervisors, established a new loan program. So last month, our Board of Supervisors allocated $500,000 from a non-general fund special revenue account to provide low-interest forgivable loans to local for-profit and nonprofit businesses. Although participation in other state or federal programs like the PPP program that was talked about during the plenary session doesn't preclude anyone from applying for this loan, we heard from our business community that many of our local businesses were not able to participate in the program. And it just, unfortunately, as I said, not many of our businesses were able to take advantage of that opportunity. So we saw this as an opportunity to either supplant or supplement any other assistance they may be receiving at this time. Each qualifying applicant for our loan program is able to receive up to $10,000. While this may seem like a small amount, our board, based on the input they received from the task force and others of the business community, felt that this amount would help our local businesses to either stay afloat longer during closures, or it could be used towards additional investments that businesses are now required to make in order to provide a safe environment for not only its employees, but also its customers. We recently made the award announcements, and the 50 businesses that were selected are currently going through the next stage of funding. So depending on the results or impact of this program, at least this first phase, what it has on our community, the board is considering issuing a second round of funding. So that was just to really highlight, here in Imperial County, due to our limited personnel and our trust in leaning on the experts, and that's the business community in this section, we have encouraged the business community to be directly involved in the county's response and recovery efforts through the actions and events that I just kind of went over with you. I know that was pretty quick. I sometimes tend to talk a little fast, so I apologize for that. But I'll leave it there for now. And again, thank you all for your time, and I'll pass it back to Annalisa for any questions you guys might have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark and Rebecca, both for your insights in working in your county of Imperial. Susan, do we maybe have one question for now that we could ask Mark and Rebecca?
We do, and this came from Simone Cordery-Cotter. While Mark was speaking, I believe, what consideration is Imperial Valley Transportation Commission giving to the fact that the $2 billion in ag is vulnerable to water availability and climate change, not just a pandemic?
I'll take an early stab, and I think Becky might be able to add to that point. But Imperial has longstanding water rights that it has, and part of that benefit is that we have in comparison to, let's say, maybe our Central Valley folks, and that we have direct access to the Colorado River as it borders our county to the east. But the longstanding water rights give us a level of confidence for the farming community moving forward. And then as it relates to climate change, our businesses are constantly charged with protecting their water usage and trying to use whatever mechanisms to reduce or to best use it so that it's not gone to waste. I'm trying to look for a term, but anyhow, Becky, do you have something else to add to that point?
Not much. And just mainly in agreement with Mark. We are pretty confident with the water availability that we have during this time, just due to the water rights that Imperial Valley has through the Imperial Irrigation District. However, that doesn't preclude us from practicing climate controlled measures and making sure that we are watching our water usage. And many of our cities, I believe, still do implement those measures that we were taking place during the drought of last year. So, we're still practicing making sure to watch our water use, not just businesses, but residences as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark and Rebecca. And for folks who have not been able to answer their questions thus far, we will definitely come back to you. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Aneesh Raman to give some final thoughts and remarks on the state perspective before we move into our general question and answer time. Aneesh?
Great, thank you. First, I should apologize. I'm in a county where, as you can tell, haircuts are not yet permissible. So bear with me as I wait for that to open up. I thought I'd just briefly tell you about my background and why I'm such a big believer in cross-sector partnerships. Second, talk about what we were doing around cross-sector partnerships in the governor's office pre-COVID. Then talk about how we've pivoted in COVID, and then some of the lessons learned that I've seen both in this experience and then across my career. So first, before the governor's office, I spent the last 5 years in the tech sector, most recently heading up global economic impact for a big tech company. And before that, spent 5 years in the Obama administration. So I know cross-sector partnerships at a global, federal, and state level. And I think given the challenges we face as a society, there is no other way to go after big, complex problems than with a cross-sector partnership. It's got to be part of every playbook. No one sector can do any of this on their own. And if each sector is doing it on their own, they're often running into each other or in silos, and we're not having the scale of impact that we would all hope, given the work that we do. Before COVID, my job consisted in terms of public-private partnerships around the Regions Rise Together initiative, which we launched with Cal Forward, and then the Future of Work Commission. Outside of my work, Kathleen Kelly-Janis in our office also was managing a number of public-private partnerships around housing and homelessness. When COVID hit, we recognized the scale of challenges was much bigger, and it was almost unifying because now we all had to focus on this one area that had all these subcomponents. And so the governor launched a massive task force in terms of public-private partnerships and task forces of about now 103 people that was meant to have representatives from academia, from activism, from the business community, from all regions. Depending on who you ask, we got the math kind of right, not right. It's really hard to have everyone represented, especially when you get to that size, and we're continuing to adjust based on feedback. But that has been the main way that we've tackled the COVID crisis in terms of cross-sector collaboration. I would say that there are 4 areas that we've focused that work in the task force. The first is data sharing, and that was really helpful in the early days where we were all living this really new, unprecedented experience together, and we were able to, in real time, share what we were learning within the government and in Sacramento, and also hear data and feedback that we otherwise wouldn't get in the day-to-day operations of government from other sectors. There were certain areas where, the second point, we wanted specific feedback. So the guidance that we rolled out really was vetted, not just out of GoBiz to all the external groups, but also with the task force. And that was really important because obviously as public servants, we had a conceptual idea of what the different stages meant and how different sectors could reopen. But being able to pressure test that with the people who are going to have to abide by those guidelines was critical feedback to make sure that they were actually actionable guidelines, that they made sense, and that they could allow for reopening. The third area of partnership within the task force has been advocacy. So you saw the full task force send a joint letter that got covered in CNBC, and the governor talked about in national press around increased federal support. That remains a key focus area for us. So much of what we're going to be able to do or not do is dependent upon additional federal stimulus. And so that's another way where we were able to take something that was otherwise going to be just us championing a cause and make it about the state writ large and all sectors who all have interest in an investment in further federal stimulus. And then the fourth area is really around partnerships. And those are the hardest ones, but also the ones where you can do things you otherwise wouldn't do. And so we're going to be rolling out, as an example, in July, a campaign about shopping local and supporting our small businesses across the state. And that's being done out of our Office of Small Business Advocacy, but also in partnership with all the companies that are part of the task force and that are part of the small business subcommittee. So those are kind of the 4 areas we focus across sector partnership within the task force. In terms of some of the lessons, and this isn't just from the task force, but across my career, I'd say there are 2 buckets. One is just tactical lessons, and one is just lessons we can all keep in mind as we do our work day to day. On tactical lessons, I think it's really important when you're doing cross-sector partnerships or collaboration to have clarity on what the objectives are. So these partnerships or engagements can be anywhere on the spectrum of just stakeholder engagement, which really you have to always be mindful you're taking people's time, or they could be doing other things. So is it just about making sure they're updated on work that you're doing? That's probably just one engagement. Is it recurring feedback, and how do you structure that, all the way up to partnerships that are going to get more involved and people are going to invest more than just their time. So you have to be really clear, I think, at the front end of what you're trying to do and build the right process against that objective. I think second, you really need to have an owner who's driving the process. It can't be a bunch of people who are spending 10% of their time thinking about this in whichever sector this initiative is launching. Someone's got to really be thoughtful about it. Someone's got to be preparing the agendas. Someone's got to be making sure there's a project tracker. Someone's got to be making sure that there are metrics that you're all assigning to the work and is checking how you're doing against those metrics. That's the way you make it real. So again, unless it's just a one-off stakeholder engagement call, you really want to have someone who's thinking about it and who's driving it against some key deliverables and key metrics. And then the third thing I'd say is a real ability to be agile. Cross-sector partnerships are relationships, and they change based on who you're trying to do this partnership with. They change based on the dynamics of the project you're trying to execute. So you will never have the perfect formula out of the gate. What you want to do is come up with the right way to get through phase 1. And then you want to build in a moment and a marker where you can look back, see what worked, see what didn't, and then adjust. What you want to hold yourself accountable alongside impact in all of the work is that you are making this process worthy of the time you're asking of the participants who aren't in your sector and in your organization. Because you're going to be worse off if you launch this and they feel frustrated at the other end of it than if you had just done nothing at all. So it's really important that you have that ability to be agile. I'll just close on some of the ways I think about cross-sector partnership in my day-to-day, which I think is helpful for everyone to at least consider. The first is, having been on both sides in the private sector and the public sector, I often think about how in my day-to-day, I can be bringing in some habits from the other sector. So my day-to-day in the public sector, how can I think more like the private sector in terms of success metrics, in terms of the urgency of execution, in terms of the accountability of impact? When I was in the private sector, I thought about how I can bring my public sector habits in. How do I think about unintended consequences? How do I think about the constituencies that we're trying to impact and making sure that their voices are heard? So I think that's something that we can all do. And if you don't have that cross-sector experience, I would really encourage everyone to seek it out in one-off projects or in conversations, just so that if your whole career has been in one sector, you're able to bring some of those habits into your work. The second is when you are executing programs that aren't cross-sector programs, that you are thinking about those other sectors in a very real way. I always like to point out in workforce development, for example, that comes out of the government, far too often, we are not thinking about what the employer needs are and what the jobs are that we're trying to train people for, so that we know the work that we're putting into that training is going to lead people to have skills that will get them jobs. And that's a good example of engaging the other sector, not necessarily in a partnership, but in feedback to make sure that what you're doing is going to have an impact. On the other side, as we did small business campaigns out of the tech industry, making sure that we're thinking deliberately about minority-owned small businesses and about ways that we can expand opportunity and not just run a program for the sake of it. So those are some of the ways, as you think about impact, you can make sure you're thinking about other sectors. And then lastly is when you do partner. And I just think more and more partnership is going to be the way that we get big change done. And I think about cross-sector partnerships as important for three reasons. One is you have a shared ownership of risk. It's really hard to take risk and innovate within the government because voters and citizens have a low threshold for what they allow for failure out of government appropriately. And so when you bring in the private sector, you have someone who can own that responsibility of risk and innovation. Second is shared capital. And so that's where philanthropy, I think, becomes really important. Having philanthropy come in and be able to do that seed capital, that early investment into a new idea that the private markets aren't going to do. And then third is scale the government can bring and a definition of the problem. This is what we think is a big problem. This is how we should all across sectors measure success. And that helps you align all these efforts across all the sectors together, because we have a lot of people who are trying to do a lot of good across all sectors, but they're doing so in really disorganized ways. And so one of the important roles I think the government sector plays is setting the framework, the problem statement, and then what are some of the metrics we can all hold ourselves accountable in terms of impact. So I'll stop there and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Aneesh. Susan, do we have a question or two for Aneesh right now?
We do. Aneesh, this comes from Sean Takita. How does the state view the role of local information and need for universal access to open, secure networks?
So just to push on that, is that, you mean in terms of broadband, or is that local information in terms of county guidance?
So he says broadband and media.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things there. One is accessibility. So one of the key areas of the task force is going to be to look at the digital divide that we have in California. It's an urgent question as we think about COVID and the implications on schools and the inequalities we're seeing in terms of learning based on what sort of devices families have and what sort of internet access they have. So that's a really key issue for us. You know, a lot of our work is to set a broad framework and then allow for the counties to really take that and apply it locally. The governor is a regionalist. It was a big impetus for the Regions Rise Together initiative. So we don't pretend to have a one-size-fits-all solution out of Sacramento. And we really have been trying to empower local communities, especially counties, to move at the pace that they want to move and to organize in the way that best represents local needs. We're obviously a nation state, and so we've got to be deferential to the variations that exist across regions. And so that's been a big part of how we've thought about our work.
Great. Sean, I wondered if you wanted to add anything there? Okay, not seeing him come off mute. So
Oh, I'm
there's-
sorry. I'm sorry, it took me a second. Thank you so much. I think your remarks are fantastic. I guess we're thinking about the information ecosystem and the sort of decline of local media. One of the impacts that we're seeing of the pandemic is advertising revenues and the basic sustenance for even the small remaining local media outlets we have that do local news. So I guess embedded in that question about broadband access and internet access is the whole way that local communities inform themselves about, like, how do we know what our public health officer says? I actually have better access to information depending on where I live from Sacramento or from LA or from New York than I have from my county seat.
Yeah, I think that's such a critical point, and it actually raises a lesson that I probably should have said earlier. Whenever you think about cross-sector partnerships, the public is a partner. Even if they're not officially represented at the table with someone that is their representative, like that's the goal of the work. And so you either have to build in focus groups and an ability to really understand what the user, in whatever case you're using it as in terms of the citizens' need. But with your efforts, public outreach has to be critical. And we are in a moment, and I say this as someone who, before Obama, I was a reporter for CNN overseas as a war correspondent. I understand at a really fundamental level the importance of local journalism in our ability to function as a democracy. And journalism is under incredible strain right now. And so there is both a need for us all to support local journalism and to also make sure that we are not collectively leaving unaccounted for that outreach and education to our citizens. Because ultimately, especially in something like COVID, where it's always changing, the science is shifting, people are confused and they need to know what are the simple, specific things they can do to stay safe? What are the simple, specific things they can do to shop safe? What are the simple, specific things they can do to be in a safe workplace? And what are the things that they should do if those things aren't true? And so I think that's a big push that we are trying state down, but that everyone should be doing, I think, also bottom up.
Wonderful. Thank you, Aneesh. We're going to move to a question and answer time for the entire group. Susan, if you are able, since I see we have some action on the chat, do you mind fielding the first couple questions for me?
Sure. Aneesh, this one is from Simone Cordery-Cotter. How do you quantify success in a cross-sector partnership? Is it primarily financial, or would you examine other success markers such as job quality, conservation goals met, or families lifted out of poverty?
Yeah, any or all of it. I mean, I think it's hard to have any sort of hard, fast rule across those partnerships. It's so specific to what your objectives are and what you're trying to do. And you're also going to want to create some agility to revisit whatever success metrics you've attached at the front end pretty quickly. So at the beginning, your success metric really is making this engagement worth the time of the other sector participants. That's like your bar for entry. And so you have to think about what that looks like. What do they need? What are they looking for in the engagement? If you don't meet that bar, you're worse off having done it than you're worse off having done it. So you have to do that. And then I think it's really talking with them about what are we trying to impact? And there are any number of ways you can think about success metrics. It can be the reach of your efforts in terms of how many people know about it, how many people use a certain tool that you're putting out there, all the way to the specifics of how many lives you're impacting in a way that you can measure. But I would say with cross-sector partnerships, I'm generally someone that says we should hold ourselves incredibly accountable to data and metrics. You have to be a little loose on it because it is so messy. And ideally, you're trying to do something that isn't happening on its own. And because it's cross-sector, you have different habits and sensibilities that are coming to play. And so I would say it's really important to identify making it useful for everyone's time, and then having kind of a first cut at what the metrics are that are attached to the objectives. And then I would say the third thing is just making sure you have a process pretty quickly to revisit those and adjust those.
Thank you, Aneesh. Question for Paul. How did the 3 teams get developed, and who did the inviting of members? And Aneesh, don't go far. There's another one for you coming up. Paul, are you there?
I am, Susan. Initially, we reached out to natural partners. So the research team being chaired by our CSU president and UC chancellor, that's a natural for us because those two chair our education council and have for a while. So I think there were some natural partnerships, but we've added partners that we don't work with all the time. Our two sheriffs are heading a public safety subcommittee because each sheriff works, has a monthly meeting with all the chiefs of police. So we're trying not to grow bureaucracy. We're trying to use natural relationships wherever possible. So it was, I think, and I would say the other was there was a lot of people that came and asked to be a part of the work as well.
Thanks, Paul. I wonder if from our other regions, Imperial Valley and Redwood Coast, you might want to also address that question as to how you brought partners and cross-sector partners into your collaborations.
Well, you know, we started with the core group of service providers that we were familiar with. And again, as I mentioned earlier, and I think Leila talked about, we had a network already in place. We worked, you know, closely with folks from various sectors. And quite honestly, you know, the group grew just naturally. We basically said to the core group, you see what we're trying to do, you know the purpose. We read the purpose of the meeting every day, every time we meet at the beginning. Bring people in who you think either need to learn what we're doing here or can contribute. And so we started getting a lot of, you know, invites from members. It really is, you know, the other thing about what we do here is it really is a distributed leadership model. Where each person is taking their own individual responsibility, making their own individual contributions, and then with what Leila talked about with the Redwood group is those you know, team leaders and teams are self-identified through the call and are meeting separately. So the call really just is a report out and information sharing and any group decisions that have to be made. But sometimes the best way to design these things is not design them and let them evolve naturally. We tend to over-design these things sometimes, and you know, it becomes unwieldy, it becomes unnatural. And so the evolution that occurred feels really natural now. And I'm working with people that, you know, I've lived in this county since 1965, except for a short time away. And I'm working with people I haven't worked with or before. And I don't know why, quite honestly. So that's kind of our thing. I don't know if Leila wants to add to that.
I think that essentially summarizes it. I would add one little thing with my hat on as a program evaluator that my experience with this group, but in previous cross-sector groups as well, informs me that unless the group is really committed to identifying theories of change in advance, maybe doing some formative research, maybe identifying specific inputs and activities that they're going to track, and being very humble about the degree to which the results achieved were actually based on the work of the cross-sector group, then you know, it could be a rabbit hole, a very deep, dark, very entertaining exercise in documenting and tracking metrics that may or may not be meaningful. So my lived experience, and also my experience as an evaluator, is to be very focused and very light-handed when it comes to documenting who's in, who's out, what the activities were, what the outcomes were, but especially the outputs are helpful to track. And the other thing that I'm going to add too is with respect to who gets invited and who participates, there is absolutely an invisible degree of network building happening with people who are not able to be on these regular calls, but who are being looped in for the work or being kept informed off the calls. And what I'm expecting is once shelter in place is lifted and it becomes more reasonable for us to reconvene in person, our next county or multi-county economic summit is going to be very interesting because people will recognize one another's work and not just one another's faces when the time comes to get work done.
Yeah.
Long-term work done. Thanks.
Okay. Mark and Rebecca, did you have anything you wanted to add in response to this one?
Yeah, so just very naturally, very much like Redwood, it was just very organically kind of formed through some certain directors at local chambers, met with IBEDC, which is our Economic Development Corporation, and our SBDC. And from there, the membership has grown. The county itself was not part of its original founding members, but it is now part of it through our workforce development department. And so very similar process to what Gregg and Leila were sharing in regards to pretty much the invitation's open to everybody. There's no formal invitation as to how you can participate. If you can participate, because we understand, just like Leila shared, not everybody can. So it's a lot of information sharing going on amongst those that are participating at the meetings itself. For example, just, for the county here, I'm part of the Joint Information Center for the Emergency Operations Center as well. And we have someone, part of our JIC, that is participating as well, because in addition to the work that they're doing, we need to make sure that we're communicating it to the public, the general public. So that's how we kind of do so, and it was nothing formal. And in all honesty, it's been very informal throughout this process, but we've been able to make it work.
Thank goodness we didn't have time to design this.
Right.
Because we would design the usefulness right out of it, trying to get everything just right. And it was like, we don't have time to design this thing. We're meeting every day when we started, and it was like, okay, so who should we invite? Everybody? Okay, good. Now what do we want to do? Stuff that got to get done is important, and those things were facing us. They were screaming in our face that need to get done. And so, so much of the time we over-design this stuff, trying to get it just right, that we kill it before it even gets out of the gate.
And I think that as you start meeting, you start to identify those parties that aren't at the table that need to be at the table.
Right.
Which is what they started realizing, hey, we have a huge ag industry here. I mean, we're ag dependent as well. And we need to make sure the Farm Bureau is a part of these discussions because they're all being impacted as well. And so, as I said, they just started bringing in more and more people as they identified who wasn't at the table that needed to be there.
Yep.
Okay, we have one more question before we hand it back to Annalisa, and this one is for Aneesh again. Although Aneesh, I think this webinar today is trying to help with this, but the question is, how are you documenting best practices in cross-sector partnerships? How can these be accessible to all of us so we can learn from each other? So other than webinars like this one, what do you recommend there?
It's a great question. It's probably a failure of cross-sector partnerships writ large that I don't have any easy to recommend resources. It's lived experience, and I think you're hearing it from all of us on the call. And their shared experience and shared lessons. And so maybe one of the do-outs for Cal Forward working with us is to try to actually make this more specific and into kind of a toolkit with everyone on this call, at least, to share it out. I'm sure if you Google, cross-sector partnerships, there are plenty of resources. My lessons have all just been born out of life experience. And so I just don't know, but let me defer to the other panelists too, because they might have better specific resources.
One of the ways we structured the call was, as I mentioned earlier, based on an airport call that I get to listen into. My wife lives on the East Coast. I live here on the West Coast, and she works in an airport. And it was really interesting. It's for a large airport on the East Coast in New York City. And every morning at 8 a.m., they have the same call with the same people, the heads of every important function at the airport, and including my wife. And I was really impressed because they can, in 20 minutes to a half an hour, basically identify everything that's happening that day, what the issue is. And it's the same person leaves the meeting at the same time. I don't know, it intrigued me because you could tell they're very natural about it. They know exactly what they're supposed to report on, what they're doing. And their job is to move 35 to 50,000 people through that airport that day. You know, it was very refreshing to listen to that call. For one thing, it was only 20 minutes to a half an hour, but they got stuff done. And they have a you know, sort of like they have the conductor, and it's like everybody's singing out of the same, you know, they all have their parts in the choir and they all solo for a minute, and they get it done. And it's not, you know, it may not be the best for long-term strategic thinking and planning. Obviously that occurs elsewhere, but you know, that for us, that wasn't, we didn't have time to do long-term strategic planning for a variety of reasons, one of which we didn't even know what was going to be happening the next day. So how do you, you know, we do our, you know, our SWOT analysis, you know, it was like our threats would have been all of them and none of them because we didn't know what was coming. And so, you know, I think that's been working for us, and people are really used to it, and know how to work together now.
Thank you, Gregg. Everybody, Paul wanted me to point out that he had in fact been able to answer the question about the drop in the information sector in the chat window. That job loss is due to the end of landline systems, closure of regional newspapers, filming and movies, and TV shutdown. So thank you for getting, yeah.
Susan, it's Paul. I just wanted to to that last question. I think Aneesh is right. I think we need to find a way to capture this information. You know, Peter from Coca-Cola was talking about closing streets and letting restaurants put tables in the street, you know, 3 months ago, because they were seeing that as an option. And I think the information gathering that we're hearing from developers who are looking at apartments and housing stock, and now planning not 1, but 2 home offices because this works. I think there's a lot of information out there that can be gleaned through these task forces that could really help the state as a whole recover more quickly.
Great. Annalisa, handing back to you to close us up.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone who joined the call, and a special thank you to all of our presenters and speakers. We hope the session was informative, insightful, but most importantly, inspired us to do some of the tough work of cross-sector collaboration. So yes, thank you. There's all the emails here. I'll leave this slide up for a moment if you'd like to jot some notes. And as Susan alluded, this will be recorded and the slides shared with all in attendance. So it's been a pleasure learning with all of you today, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.